Meanwhile, the world is already adjusting to President Trump. It's like Joe Biden never existed. I know, it's like his worst nightmare. Joe Biden, he thinks that he built himself a legacy. And then, of course, he was ousted for Kamala Harris, and now he has disappeared into the wilderness, never to be heard from again. But the world is just going right back to what it was before, namely more peaceful and more afraid of America, which is not a coincidence. More afraid of America generally means more peaceful. That is the way the world works. It is unfortunate that that is so. It also happens to be the reality. On a business level, according to the Wall Street Journal, businesses are already beginning to stock up on imported goods before Donald Trump dumps tariffs on China. They're also considering how to cope with the levies if and when enacted, whether they will be able to raise prices, whether they will need to find alternatives to their Chinese manufacturers. When Trump began his trade war against China in 2018, U.S. businesses scrambled to front-load imports before tariffs were implemented, according to the IMF. As a result, the U.S.'s trade deficit with China rose in 2018 before falling in 2019. Already, exports from China surged last month. Some economists think that was driven at least in part by front-loading, people buying the stuff before they think it's going to be tariffed. But all of that is simply a predicate to what happens next, which is a shifting of production outside of China. China is still the world's top exporter of goods, and the U.S. is still its top buyer. American companies bought roughly $430 billion of Chinese goods last year. Computer and electronic products make up the biggest chunk of that. But cut off the American markets to the Chinese, and they do actually have a problem. There's been a lot of talk about China having other markets. That, of course, is true. They've cultivated Latin America. They've cultivated parts of Africa. The United States is an extremely rich market for Chinese product. And we shouldn't just be using our leverage against China. We should be using our leverage against Europe to use against China, because the Western world has to be unified against the Chinese aggression that is burgeoning in the South China Sea and Taiwan Straits. Otherwise, we're going to sleepwalk our way right into a war. The way that actual World War III happens is not by simple accident. It happens when one power actually believes the other power is not going to move, or that they have an advantage in moving first. That is how world wars actually happen. They work out of hope. It's not like somebody just fires a shot and magically World War III breaks out. Typically, the situation has to be right in order for everybody to go weapons up. And that's usually when one side misperceives its own strength. Well, if the United States flexes muscle, it'll be much more difficult for China to misperceive its own strength. According to the Wall Street Journal, some economists doubt the U.S. will succeed in raising tariffs to 60% across the board on Chinese products. But economists at Goldman Sachs predict additional duties on China could average out to a 20 percentage point increase in the effective tariff rate, which would be really, really significant. Now, what does that mean? Well, obviously, listen, for American consumers, it means higher prices, because that's what tariffs are. It also means a rethinking of America's national security needs vis-a-vis China, which is a good thing. And this also means the United States is going to have to, as I say, increase its leverage on other countries with how they deal with China. According to the New York Times, as they gathered this week in South America, many of the world's leaders were engaged in a delicate diplomatic dance with President Xi Jinping of China. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, called for a consistent, durable relationship with China. Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, pledged to be patient, calibrated, and deliberate. President Biden promised not to let competition veer into conflict. As the United States makes a transition from Biden to Trump, presidents and prime ministers around the world are searching for stability, particularly when it comes to China. Xi told Biden he wanted to maintain a stable, healthy, sustainable relationship with the United States. But potential conflicts with China loom on human rights, the fate of Taiwan, technology competition, cyber attacks, aid to Russia, and tariffs. So the term that's been used for the Trump administration policy on China is decoupling, and that is something that absolutely should be pursued with alacrity. Because continuing to feed the alligator, hoping it will eat you last, is an extraordinarily poor strategy. Let's talk about something that affects all of us responsible, hardworking Americans. Taxes. The October 15th deadline has passed. Are you prepared for what's coming now? Do you owe back taxes? Are your tax returns still unfiled? Missed the deadline to file for an extension? Well, now that October 15th is behind us, the IRS may be ramping up enforcement. Let me tell you, they do not play around. You could face wage garnishments, frozen bank accounts, even property seizures if you haven't taken action yet. But there's good news. There's still hope. Tax Network USA has been in the game for years. They know exactly how to navigate the complex world of tax law. They've helped taxpayers save over $1 billion in tax debt. They filed over 10,000 tax returns. That's billion with a B, folks. They specialize in helping hardworking Americans like you reduce their tax burdens. So don't let the IRS catch you off guard, and get ahead of this right now with Tax Network USA. Their team of professionals will work tirelessly to protect your assets and find the best solution for your unique situation. Here's what you need to do. For a complimentary consultation, call today 1-800-958-1000 or visit their website at tnusa.com/Shapiro. That's 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/Shapiro today. Don't let the IRS take advantage of you. Get the help you need with Tax Network USA. Now, Xi is issuing warnings to other people in attendance. According to the New York Times, while promising to abide by a commitment to, quote, mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and winning cooperation, the Chinese leader also said, quote, our position of resolutely safeguarding China's sovereignty, security, and development interests remains unchanged. Well, again, this is a place where Donald Trump has led historically. He's going to lead again on this. Donald Trump almost single-handedly drove a bipartisan move against China during his first term. That's a very real thing, by the way. I know Congress people on both sides of the aisle, there are very few things on which they agree. The one thing they agree on is the rising threat of China. Again, this is one of the reasons why I think that Pete Hegseth is going to make a great Secretary of Defense and why I'm urging him to pick as Secretary of the Navy Mike Gallagher, who's been on top of this, really on top of this in terms of defense of the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. So as China grows more militant, it is worth noting, by the way, that all of the sort of happy talk, the world of fantasy that has dominated American foreign policy thinking for years, it's so ridiculous. I mean, truly ridiculous. There's a piece in the New York Times today talking about the fact that China's emissions are growing faster than literally any other place on earth. That for all the talk from John Kerr about how we need to cooperate with the Chinese on climate to save the world. You know who doesn't give a crap about that? China. They do not care. They do not care whatsoever. They're in an exponential growth curve in terms of emissions. Projections show that China is probably going to exceed cumulative emissions over the course of the next few decades. According to the New York Times, for many years, wealthy places like the United States and Europe have had the biggest historical responsibility for global warming. China's astonishing rise is upending that dynamic. Over the past 3 decades, China has built more than 1,000 coal-fired power plants as the economy has grown more than 40-fold. The country has become by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gases on planet Earth. It is not close, by the way. The United States has been dropping since about the year 2000. The European Union, the same. China has increased its emissions per year from approximately 4 gigatons in the year 2000 to somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 gigatons today. Last year, for the first time, passed Europe as the second largest historical emitter. That's like cumulative. That includes all the years where Europe was leading at China. Now, China's lying about this. They're promising their emissions are going to peak this decade and then start falling. There's no reason to believe that. Cheap growth is where it's at for China. Now, the New York Times tries to make excuses for China. They say, you know what? In terms of emissions per person, it's still pretty low in China. Right, it's going to increase. Because China, if it does not continue to provide additional layers of economic growth, is going to fail. They have a lot of crises on their hands. They have a demographic crisis on their hands. They have a massive imbalance between the number of young men and young women in their country. They have serious debt crisis on their hands. They have an innovation crisis on their hands. They can steal a lot of tech. But you know who did that also? The Soviet Union. They never really caught up to the United States. So what they're going to rely on is cheap oil, cheap coal, cheap energy. It's the thing they need the most. And they're going to rely on the stupidity of the West in continuing to fund their growth. Well, I think with Donald Trump, a lot of that stuff is going to come to an end. As the Wall Street Journal points out, when Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva called for more multilateralism at the opening of the Group of 20 Nations Summit on Monday, their remark appeared aimed at Donald Trump. Many leaders from Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa at the G20 made clear their alarm at the prospects for a sharp U.S. turn inward on trade, health, and environmental policy with Trump's looming return to the presidency. When they say a turn inward, by the way, what they mean is that the United States is no longer going to sacrifice our sovereign interest to some specious international standard that helps other nations at our expense. That is not a thing that we are going to do. And the reality is other countries are already adjusting, and that is a good thing. Are you tired of the lies and the twists of the mainstream media talking points? Yeah, me too. Join me in my newest series, Fact, where I dismantle and bring truth to this tiring mainstream agenda.